Okay, I think we've got people joining. We're going to start in 1 minute. And welcome to those dialing in.
Good morning, folks. Welcome. Or good evening if you decided to join from North America.
Okay, I think we might get started. And welcome to those that are joining, still dialing in. So welcome everyone. And as Melissa just said, we have the pleasure of saying good evening, good afternoon, good morning to many of you, as we have attendees from Canada and Australia here today. So thank you all and for those that are maybe watching this back at home later. And so thank you all for making the time. We're excited about the conversation ahead. In terms of, we'll start with some introductions. So I'm Tessa Dehring, principal at Nous Group. I'm currently based in our Toronto office. I was in Melbourne for about 10 years prior to that. So I'll be one of your co-pilots for today's webinar. For those I haven't met yet, I co-lead our organizational performance and leadership practice across Nous. And I'm particularly passionate about leadership development and how we can continue to evolve our way of doing leadership development to fit within the rhythms of work. So that gives you a little bit of an inkling on why we're here today. But Melissa, why don't you introduce yourself for the group?
Yeah, and on Tessa's last statement about being really keen on leadership and organizational development, I think that's where we really intersected. So my name's Melissa Padfield. I'm Deputy Provost at the University of Alberta, which is in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. It's about a 46,000 person comprehensive medical doctoral institution. And my portfolio oversees, it's a soup to nuts of student experiences. So I oversee our Faculty of Graduate and Postdoctoral Studies, our international education and enrollment area, our registrar's office, which focuses on everything from recruitment and student promotion to admissions, financial support, records, registration, fees, convocation, and graduation. I also oversee our Dean of Students area, which covers everything from counseling services to career services to health and wellness supports and even institutional athletics teams, which are quite a big deal in Canada. And I also have an enrollment systems and service innovation function, which looks at continuous improvement and development functions. So that represents about 600 employees and quite a bit of the university support services for students. And I've been at that institution for almost 20 years now.
Great, thanks, Melissa. Just a small, just a little bit in your remit there. And so before we get into the formalities today, I would like to acknowledge that here in Toronto, I am on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. And I recognize that this land is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And I've called this land home for the last 2 years. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands of which we meet, connect, and work, and extending that out, of course, to over in Australia, where we know a lot of people are coming in today. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people here today or listening after. So in terms of the webinar today and what's in store, so we're going to start with a couple of questions for you, so we get a chance to understand who's in the room. Then Melissa and I will share a bit of background behind this idea of smart shocking. Hopefully you've had a chance to read the article, and if not, would highly recommend you do that. And of course, we'd love some feedback and engagement on it. We'll then provide an overview of some of the key concepts in the article and that we thought about quite deeply in thinking about this concept. And we'll talk through a couple of case studies. When we ran our previous webinar, it was really helpful kind of exploring, okay, how do we turn this idea into practice? And so we'll do that, as well as would love questions throughout the conversation today, but we'll also save some time at the end. We do have a few people on the line, so we will say we're going to provide you our contact details. Number one, Melissa and I are very experimental, and we love to keep refining and evolving concepts. And so we really, after this call, we really wish that you'll continue to collaborate with us on that, including experimenting in your own teams with yourself and thinking about what you might be able to trial to begin to play with this idea of smart shocking. A couple of other ground rules before we get into the poll. Research does show that we aren't great at multitasking, even though I like to think I am, but I'm not. So we won't have the chat function today, but we will have the Q&A. It just makes it a little bit simpler for Melissa and I to keep track. So if you do want to provide comments, thoughts, questions, please use the Q&A function, and Melissa and I will get that and respond to that as we go. And again, if we run out of time, we'll make sure that we connect after. So first off, let's start with a poll. We'd love to. It's an interesting concept of webinar because Melissa and I just stare at each other. We don't get a chance to stare at you. So we'd love to get a sense of who you are today that are joining us. And so we're going to just start our first poll. And so hopefully something's popped up for you to fill out.
Who's who in the Zoom room today? So it gives us a bit of a sense of how to target some of our commentary and also to share some of our experiences in ways that might most resonate with you. Do we have our results coming?
There we are. Okay.
All right,
Mix,
administrative leaders, you've
Mm.
got the majority at the moment.
And I think what's really useful is we started, this concept is quite cross-sector. So Melissa and I started talking about this in higher education, but of course it's relevant outside of that. So I see our other interested learners or even those that are leaders from outside of the sector, this will be a really relevant concept for you too. We have a second poll. So we'd also like to know what brought you here today. We know there are often various reasons to why you might jump on a webinar. The other really interesting thing you'll see here with some of the dimensions is you might think about smart shocking for yourself, for your team and others, or actually be in say a people function role and wanting to experiment with this idea in your own organization. So we'll give everyone about 30 seconds to do that one as well. Okay, so we might get the results for that.
All of the above and looking like you have it totally figured out. That was sort of our prompt, and even coming up with this concept was to find a way to look like we had it all figured out. But no, I really appreciate folks are trying to come at this in a multiplicity of different ways. And, the willingness to experiment and see what can work within your organizations is something that has really captured Tessa, as she said. And so this helps us in kind of situating as well with where we want to go tonight or this morning, depending on where you are.
So Melissa, why don't you take it away? Where did this concept of
Yeah.
smart shocking come from?
So Tessa and I had been engaged in a couple of conversations around leadership development as I was trying to stand up a new organizational model. And also I had just entered into my position that I currently hold, which is newly created and was being put in a more senior level where I was no longer leading an organization. I was leading the leaders of organizations. And when we were thinking about what were the pressures around developing those individuals, which Tessa was helping me to think through, we started to realize that there were some really acute pressures facing that sort of senior leader area in terms of being able to focus on professional development in some of the more traditional ways. So we all are familiar with going on a course, getting a new designation, finding ways to go to a conference, share thoughts with some collaborators as a way to try and extend learning. But one of the things that tends to go by the wayside, particularly as people mature in their careers, is time. First and foremost, for that personal development, we get focused on developing others more than ourselves. And it becomes more difficult to figure out how to add value to those who are really achieving well at the higher levels of performance and higher level jobs. And so as we started to move around with this and think about how, in fact, we could create a sense of development that could exist alongside what we need to get done and how we get it done in ways that would allow for going from likely good integrate, though this does apply for any kind of performance situation that you're in, we really started to think about how you could use that, what we have to get done, the shocks that come about in the course of every day, and certainly several major shocks in the course of a quarter or a term, in ways that would be more useful for the learning of those that were sitting in some of the more senior spaces. Now, we'll caveat this by saying you can use this in a developmental way for anyone that is coming into a leadership position, but we really started to focus it in on those who are not being able to get as much from traditional professional development, or those who were finding it hard to access time. And it was giving a way for the supervisors of those individuals, whether they're presidents, vice presidents, or team leads, to be intentional about how they could use the things that disrupted and disturbed in ways that could be more than just firefighting or reactive. So as a supervisor, often you'll hold space for conversations around the reactive elements of a shock. But what would happen if we started to apply something more intentional to the concept of a shock? Something that would really allow us to apply a system and intentionality to how we bring someone before, through, and after that period of disruption that can really cause folks to feel really dislocated, but can also allow for the biggest growth potential that can happen outside of this. And making sure that those moments weren't just about managing a single issue, but were around being self-reflected in a way that could allow those issues to give us learning that would take us forward and propel us forward in our current contexts, which are ever increasing in their complexity and ever increasing in the frequency with which we have to encounter new and disruptive moments in time. And so what we wanted to think about here is using, again, real moments in time intentionally with a learning experience that creates discomfort that allows for us to grow more quickly than perhaps going on a course or having a traditional kind of professional development, and could be built into a day-to-day experience in a way that was most relevant for the leader that was being worked with. So that's sort of where it came from, a desire to get back time and enhance impact. So that is our smart shocking wheel. It's intentional, it's built in, it pushes outside the comfort zone, and it really leverages real experiences based on a desire to find a way to create value for those who are finding it hard to get value out of a traditional series of experiences. So who benefits from this? And I want to start off by saying this is actually sort of a two-way benefit. And we'll talk about that in the next slide when we talk about how this differs from coaching. But this really is an opportunity to create a relationship between someone who is supervising and someone who is being supervised. And that even extends from boards to presidents. There's a supervisory relationship there that allows intentionality to come into play when managing the day-to-day business. And we do think that it's an opportunity to help people regardless of where they are in the performance continuum. Because oftentimes, either you have very high performing leaders and they aren't getting the kind of feedback in a performance review that really helps them to know where to focus, but they will encounter shocks. And those shocks will identify opportunities for spaces they haven't experienced before to be utilized in a way that can have more impact. But it can also help those that are very much in the nascency of their development. This is particularly relevant in higher education, where we get very seasoned academics that move into quite senior leadership roles without having had the same kind of leadership support throughout their academic career. So you've got folks that are very high achieving and very high potential who may not have encountered the same kinds of situations that those who had focused on an administrative background may have encountered. And so it's very helpful in that area and space as well. In other organizations and sectors, you can think about, again, it could apply for the health sector where you're bringing in a doctor that's been a practitioner at a very high level, but is now moving into a leadership space that needs a different kind of mentorship than they may have encountered in the rest of their career. So this works across the spectrum of sectors, but it really is for those folks that have high potential and need help moving forward in ways that can leverage their existing experiences. So why isn't this just coaching? And we had that in our poll, isn't it just, yes, go on. So coaching is really unidirectional. It looks at bringing the best out of an individual through a dialectic approach often that can help people get there. The difference here has a number of different features that we were talking about that is more than just regular coaching. We'll call it coaching plus plus, and also a two-way coaching intentionality. Because as you're helping someone through this as a more senior leader, you too are being able to see different areas of your organization with a more intentional focus about the skill sets and the approaches that may be most relevant in making sure your vision and your strategy are coming to life. And you're building out a team that has the skill set necessary to do that. So the first thing is we bring real intentionality to situations that both the person that you're supervising and the supervisor are experiencing together. And typically we would just react to these, we would manage them, but we're moving forward to apply a learning lens on top of a management practice. We also build in a specific rhythm around a pre-shock, a shock, and a post-shock phase that Tessa's going to walk you through the specifics of as we move forward. That allows you, again, to break it down into a system that you can apply more regularly into the course of the everyday. And it also allows you to apply a system to things that look like shocks and you're not quite sure how to navigate them for learning and development with those that are responsible for them. And there's also a much stronger focus on debrief and reflection rather than just adapting in the moment. So the idea that you take the opportunity of the doing of work collaboratively to then stop and pause and look at the learning from that work is somewhat different than the coaching as a participant as well as a help on a debrief. And then how do we extend the learning forward in this space? So those are some of the ways that this looks different. And when done really well, I think it does allow the shock to be useful for, again, as I say, the leader and that person who manages the leader as well.
Great, thanks, Melissa. And Melissa alluded to the process that we've thought about in terms of how to think about the shock. And we really wanted to be deliberate that it wasn't just about the middle, the smart shock itself, but actually there's some important pre and post phases in terms of this. So I'm just going to walk us through each of the steps. So in terms of the pre-shock, this really is planning. And so it can occur quite a length of time in advance of the actual shock. We were asked in our last webinar, can you self-shock? And you absolutely can self-shock. And so to do the pre-shock well, it's having a good understanding of your own, say if you're going to self-shock, or a good understanding of the leader's development goals that you are managing or working with. And so that means that we're ready at all times for our shock. So you can see that there's a really nice link to regular performance and career conversations, which we know not all institutions and organizations are really are embedded. And so that gives us another really great reason to do it. It's really important, particularly for us to think about individual leaders' capability and capacity, as well as the context in which they're leading, either at that time or perhaps moving into. And that means that we can ensure that we're quite intentional with the types of growth opportunities that are specific for that individual. And the other important thing around the pre-shock is it can be more visible to the leader's leader. So you would have seen in the article, we refer to the supervisor. We'd love any feedback on a great name, the leader of the leader, the supervisor. We've played around with many terms, but basically that leader who's really working with their direct report or their leader through the shock. And so this pre-shock period will look different depending on whether it's a natural, as we call it, which generally are unexpected, or a manufactured shock, which we'll talk through, which is essentially those that are actually developed by the leader's leader to walk them through, a smart shock. So then when we think about the middle, the really important thing here is every smart shock should look different and distinct for every individual. And every smart shock will vary in intensity, but the potential risk that it could have for that leader and form. And so in the article, we talk about a few examples. They are deliberately general because we'd want you to take that idea and go, okay, how would I then customize that for maybe the leader that I have in mind, or for my own self-shocking experience? And so, for example, simply it might be a strategic rethink that needs to happen in an area, or there's a planned disruption. Or it could be business model improvements or high stake projects. And so those, might sound typical to you, but it's in how the process in which you develop that shock and you do the debriefing that makes this whole thing different. What's really important is that we match the risk and intensity to the leader's professional development needs. And so I'll talk a little bit more around that shortly. And so the difference is for the leader to experience a greater degree of what we call disequilibrium, and I'll explain that shortly, but it challenges them. It's not just about a day-to-day. So a leader who's got high potential, really high performer, that shock's going to look really different to someone that perhaps is still stepping into their leadership and just getting started. So it's really important that we think quite deliberately around the shock. And then the other important thing with the shocks. Oh, sorry, do you want to come in, Melissa, and add there?
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Tess. I'll add after. Go ahead. Yeah.
Perfect. The final thing there we wanted to emphasize is that the shock, to get the most out of the shock, it's not just about whether or not the outcome of the initiative was achieved, but it's really, and actually, perhaps you'll get to the end of the shock and it might not be a success. What it really is important is that over the course of the shock, the leader has gained growth and development, and learned, and had some reflection on perhaps the skills that worked really well and set them off for success, and perhaps those things that they were exposed on or could work on for the future. And so the outcome of the shock, of course, could go in various different ways. And so for us, it's about, did that leader experience good growth and development? And that's the real benefit and outcome we're looking for here. Melissa, anything that you'd love to add for the middle part here?
Yeah, I think Tessa added a really important point there, which is the outcome is not necessarily the most important component of this. And I actually think if the pre-shock phase is done well, it actually allows you to build in an appropriate amount of risk tolerance to how we navigate shocks, which I think is really fundamental and something that we're not as I would say as sophisticated in all of our sectors as we would like to be. So when you're thinking about this through a developmental lens, it actually allows you to start assessing, even as the leader's leader, your risk tolerance in allowing the shocking process to unfold with a developmental lens in mind. And as we build out our teams, we know the complexity of the things that we face requires us to have more highly capable leaders at our tables. And so starting a pre-shock phase by acknowledging that the outcome may not be perfection is a really important prevention at allowing this to be, I think, a leaderful and also a developmental experience. And I'll just share with the sort of self-shocking how this can look in practice. So a quick example. So when I was in an earlier stage in my career, we were dealing with budget challenges and we had to go through organizational restructure. And so I was at the table of discussing what kind of a restructure we should do, what that would look like. Unfortunately, we knew we had to do some layoffs and some position disruptions. And so in doing that, I actually saw a developmental opportunity for myself because I was at the table to make the decisions, but I wasn't necessarily the person that was going to have to do the disruptions. And I hadn't to that point in my career been accountable for doing the disruption. So I approached my leader and said, I would like to do some of these disruptions, not because I think they're going to be enjoyable, but because in order to build skills and empathy that would take me to the next stage of my career, I think it's really important that I've done this. And she was game and fantastic as a leader for me in saying, absolutely, let's talk about this. How would you go about this? What are you going to try and get out of this? How do you do this in a good way? What are the things that you think you will be able to then generalize against other organizational changes that you have to make in the future? And how's that going to work? Then I went through it. And then afterwards, we talked about sort of what were my reflections? Did it change any of the ways I thought about organizational development? Did I look at consequence differently? And what kinds of things I gleaned? And so I asked for a greater shock than I was going to be participant in when we were doing that work. And that's something that you can encourage from those you supervise to look for when you thought, and this gives you language to be able to do that in a really planful way.
Thanks, Melissa. Really, really great point there, because I think even in a self shock, you absolutely need the leader involved in that. So, and what we're trying to do too is almost that reverse coaching, which is I want to embark on something that's challenging. Can you come on this journey with me? And so the final stage is the post shock, and this is the time we want to move on. I'm sure many of us can recall a really difficult, challenging experience we've gone through. We've got to the end of it. We've survived or thrived, and we want to just move on. We want to just acknowledge it's done. We've got through it, but this is actually the primus point for learning. And so this is where we get the most value out of the shock. And that's the biggest one of the big takeaways for today. Why that's important is it's really hard while you're in the shock to have really good reflection. And even in a prolonged shock, which potentially could be, a year, multi-year, there will be moments where you move in and out of the intensity of the shock that you can have this reflection. And so, but it can be really hard. I'm sure you can recall when you're in that kind of challenge mode, having that clarity and that space to think and reflect and think about your leadership. It's really rare and difficult to do. And so it's really important in the post-shock phase, your supervisor playing a really key role, but each of the leaders really stepping into this reflective zone. In our article, we'll explore, when we were thinking about this concept, we thought that there was some different lenses to be thinking about here. And so you can see here, it's reflection on how the leader showed up as a leader, how the leader led others, and even the broader impact on the institution. And so, again, one of the big leadership behaviors that we're trying to develop in higher education institutions is that the enterprise view. Because naturally, the way that a university is set up is we're very focused on perhaps the patch, the area, the function, the unit, the faculty, and so getting that reflection around what the broader impact on the institution is helpful. And one of the really important things, which we alluded to earlier, was around asking that leader, what skills would you have liked to feel more confident about to manage the situation with less stress? And so it's a shock deliberately meant to put people in out of their comfort zone. And so really, really getting that reflection around what skill development they still need coming out of it is a really useful piece of data and information to do to look for after. It's really important that this is not just a one-way or that kind of coaching style relationship that Melissa talked to. It's about both getting the leader to reflect on each of these questions, but even the supervisor coming to the table, helping them understand what gaps did they see, what did they see versus what did they see in themselves. The other thing that we really would encourage you to experiment on is actually getting those that maybe are involved in the shock or impacted by the shock involved in this kind of post-shock debrief and reflection. So it might be the leaders team. It could be perhaps some stakeholders that were involved in participating in the shock. So hopefully you have a better sense after following us walking through the phasing of the shock and maybe even thinking about some potential shocks that you could do within your teams or yourself. The last bit of sort of theory here we wanted to acknowledge, I'd use the word disequilibrium, and it's from Ronald Heifetz. So one of the co-developers of the adaptive leadership framework, and we were thinking about what underpinning theories and frameworks sit underneath smart shocking, and then why do we think it works? And so the productive zone of equilibrium is a really useful framework here, and many of you may have already seen this before. We use this quite a lot as part of our leadership development work and the way that we think about designing learning experiences. And as you can see on the diagram, the real art is getting in the productive learning zone. And so, as you can see, over level of challenge and time, we're wanting to spend enough time in that sort of sweet spot of learning. And so you can see it's really about getting that balance right. And what plays into this really effectively is if you've got a good sense of the leader's capability, capacity, and context, you can then work out what does that threshold of learning look like? And then how do we ensure that it's not too cold, so the experience isn't too easy, and it's not too hot. So we're sort of over challenging those leaders. Sometimes you do need to get to the really hot part to work out it's too hot, I would say. And once you get there, you go, oh, maybe that's too hot. Let's kind of reduce some of the challenge. And so in the case of a prolonged shock, you might move in. You need to manage energy to move in and out of the threshold of learning. So you can imagine if you're embarking on, say, a yearly shock, you'd need to be moving in and out of this zone because it's just going to be, you're going to end up too hot because it's requiring too much of that leader over a prolonged period of time. For those that are more of a sort of standalone or time-bound shock, you might find that this kind of curve is sort of shorter and it's a bit easier to kind of stay in that threshold zone over the period of that entire shock. Melissa, anything that you'd like to add on this model?
I really think something that folks are probably starting to have niggle at the back of their brains as listening to this is the necessity of a real trust relationship between
Mm,
a leader and the leader's leader in order for this to be effective. And one of the things I think that this model lends itself to is a greater degree of transparency over how and in which ways a senior person might approach their leadership of another senior person. So being able to say, like, my goal is to make sure that you can be as effective as possible in what you want to do. To do that, I want to keep building the skills you're interested in building and the ones I see you as needing. And so this is the kind of approach I'm going to take. And this is why disequilibrium can help. And this is how we're going to unpack it afterwards so that it feels like it's productive for you. Because, spoiler alert, you're going to get into a situation that feels like a significant shock, right? It's going to happen on a regular basis, regardless of how good a leader you are. And here's the way in which we're going to approach it. So I think really situating this in the development of trust. If you do this approach well, it enhances a trust between a supervisor or a leader of a leader and the person that they're working with. If you do it behind the curtain, in a sort of way that seems like you're not fully transparent about what the opportunity is in this approach, then it can feel like something that could erode trust. So we really encourage, I think, a real transparent approach, one that situates this in the why. Also, when we're thinking about higher education, for those of you that work in that sector, grounding something in theory and research is always helpful at getting buy-in of academic leaders to participate in a development and a growth opportunity such as this.
great. Thanks, Melissa. So we're going to move to a couple of case studies. So Melissa, I might hand back to you to talk us through the first case study here.
Yeah, so we'll call this, as well as it's making progress at a new level, it's also the what got you here doesn't necessarily keep you here. And there's a lot of opportunities for folks to experience shocks that can be quite surprising, particularly senior academic leaders who have a deep grounding in certain aspects of their role, but are encountering a new way of needing to show up with both information and impact. And so the case study we have here, and hopefully this will sound familiar to some folks, is that there needs to be a shift in the way we communicate for impact at different levels in the organization. I had a colleague of mine relate this to, at certain points in your career, you're going to need to be the spreadsheet equivalent, the Excel spreadsheet. You're going to give a lot of details. That level of detail is going to be how you communicate your value because you have deep subject matter expertise. Then you're going to roll that up into a Word document because you're starting to summarize the Excel information from other folks. From there, you're going to have to move to the next level, which is the slides presentation, right? So you're going to have to get more snippets that people can scan. And then you're going to end your career with the elevator pitch. And it all draws on the same information, but it's targeted in a different way for impact. And so in this scenario, what we have is a senior leader who needs to build buy-in to a particular organizational pillar around our institutional strategy. And they create a way to communicate that they feel is very grounded in all of the details that are required. They need to make sure that they're able to advance this pillar by the communication that they do. And we have a very suspicious organization. Maybe they've undergone a lot of change. They've had a lot of disruption. This is familiar to all of us with budget cuts and changing immigration practices and different financial models and different legislative practices. And so you have a high charged environment within which you're trying to communicate. And so what happens is the person goes out and does this communication, but it falls flat. The impact isn't there. Folks get confused by details. They suddenly aren't able to advance this pillar because it's prompting more questions than answers. It's feeling like their way of outlining this through an academic lens of here's the data, here's the work, here's how it goes. And so the logical conclusion is this change or is this initiative is suddenly not resonating. And that can really shock a leader's ability to believe in themselves as to how they communicate. And so in this case, as a leader of that leader, you either saw this shock coming or you didn't. If you saw it coming, you have a choice point as to whether or not you let it happen so that they're able to gain the learning. That's another piece of the puzzle with smart shocking. You can see a shock arise that you think can be developmental and decide to manage the risk, but not to prevent the shock so that the learning can happen, or you can choose to prevent the shock. So these are choice points based on what kind of learning the individual you're working with might need. In this case, the leader in question, we worked together to really try and take away from this, what were the gaps? How can we reframe communication in a way that can be more impactful? This is a focused shock over a period of time that's very sort of limited. The impact is high of the shock if we don't get it right, but there's a real opportunity to start to distill stakeholder needs, to understand the different level of communication. Was I using the Excel spreadsheet when I should have been using the slides or the elevator pitch? Was that the reason why people got caught up on this? How could this have gone better? And then in doing that, what, to Tessa's good point previously, what skills did I lack to be able to identify what the stakeholder group or the initiative needed in order to be most impactful? What didn't I understand about the politics of this space, not just the details of the space? How come facts didn't counterbalance feelings? What was my role as a leader in helping folks to be able to reconcile those two? And so in order to move someone through this shock, it's really important, number one, to give a good debrief about what happened in the moment, how the experience came to pass, what could have changed in the lead up, and then how to reorient for the future and to come back into the space to be more impactful in the communication. This one comes up a lot, where the way in which we have chosen to communicate isn't as effective as we would like it to be. Communication failures, I think, are some of the best shocks for learning how your organization works, the way in which communication is most effective, the politics of an organization, the structures that are at play, and it really does allow for a multidimensional evaluation of the way in which we understand our work and the way in which we show up as leaders. And so this is a good one for illustrating how you can use something that comes up time-bound and regularly for greatest impact.
Great, thanks, Melissa. And so we've got a second case study here, and we refer to this as the tale of two leaders. And so really what this is, so in terms of the context here, and this is a kind of familiar scenario for me particularly. So there was an executive leader, level sort of administrative leader. We've kept it quite general so that you can kind of think about what that looks like in your context, also if you're not from the university sector. And so this leader wants to support the leadership. So they're trialing shocks. They want to support the leadership development of two very different leaders in their portfolio. And we wanted to emphasize that shocks are for people at various different stages. And so this case study really talks to that. It also requires the executive leader to think really deliberately and carefully about the types of shocks. And so what we've got here is an example of how you might think about a shock differently depending on where that leader's at. And so some of the key considerations are ensuring that the shocks match that leader's journey. So both the capability and the capacity that we talked about earlier. The intensity of the shocks are different. So the one on the left, which I'll talk through, is a prolonged shock for our high potential leader. And for our good performer, really strong technically, it's more of a time-bound shock. And then the executive leader's role differs throughout the process, which I'll talk you through shortly. So our first leader taking on new heights. And so this is a high potential leader, experienced director. I'm sure you can probably think of someone really high potential, maybe in your team or that you've worked with, or it could be yourself at some point in your journey or now. And so you can see thinking about some of the strengths, so strong at delivery, high emotional intelligence and people skills, that ability to kind of build relationships across the university, which are really important, as we know, in working in higher education. But they've got some critical development opportunities, as all of our high potential leaders do. Unless I've never met a perfect leader, and I don't think we ever should or will. And so this person has got really strong potential for a senior role, but has reservations. Less confident, perhaps challenging in those more senior leaders, and also getting workload balance right. I know many of us probably see those high potentials in the workplace, and that ability that get more work as a reward. And so how do we kind of tackle that? And so the shock itself is leading a whole of university transformation project. It's prolonged, as you can imagine, multi-year, and there are many stakeholders. And the reason why this opportunity has arisen, many universities, in Canada, in Australia, in the UK and beyond, are going through transformations. They need really strong leaders to take them forward. And so this person, fits the bill in terms of the types of things, one that the university needs, but also would lend itself to really aligned development opportunities. The really interesting thing here at the bottom is because it's a prolonged shock, the role of that leader's leader is really important. And if you refer to when I talked about the disequilibrium before, this leader is going to go in and out of that sweet spot, probably find themselves in the too hot um, spot a few times because we know how challenging, say, trying to get alignment across the university will be. And so the leader's leader is really important here to provide those safeguards and that safe space and also that opportunity to have continuous debriefing and learning. So that post-shock period looks a little bit differently because it needs to be regular and continuous. And that can be really hard to do over multi-years. And so it requires quite a lot of discipline from the leader and the leader's leader. On the right, this is a really different leader. So, and we often we can probably think about some people in this bucket too. Really good performer, strong technically, strong relationships with team and peers, really likable, but has some challenges in holding the team accountable to deliver, high quality. Has an opportunity to think more strategically. So plays in the day to day because of that technical expertise, and it's the safe spot. So the shock itself is thinking about business model improvements. And we've chosen this one again because we know a lot of universities are embarking on this at the moment. And there is a really important opportunity actually to create some shocks for internal leaders within institutions. So the key here was thinking about how you can line up the business model improvement with an area that the leader isn't familiar with or finds comfort in. So we deliberately pick a unit within their function that they don't have technical expertise in, and perhaps have had challenges holding the team accountable because of either being too nice, having too good of relationships, or perhaps not spending enough time there because of that technical focus. And so the features here, more tight, like a time-bound shock. It's not as prolonged as the whole of university transformation. And it's really about driving personal team and team transformation. So this shock's not just about the leader, it's actually about the team that leader's leading. So sometimes you see this really nice, well, actually pretty much all shocks will create some domino effect to the people around them. And finally, the role of the executive leader looks different here. So it's more purposeful coaching, helping them work through roadblocks, and you can already anticipate as the leader maybe some of the things that will come up for this person, just given where they're at and their strengths and their development areas. So if I was the leader's leader, I'd be thinking about how I can anticipate some of the things that they're going to need help with, and even start to think about it myself as their leader. So when they come to me, you've got some good ideas and some good advice to share and help them through this process. Melissa, anything that you'd like to add to these scenarios as well?
I think when we're thinking about these scenarios, the notion of agency really looms large for me. And it's giving people back their agency in times where they can feel like things are happening to them, right? In both of these instances, whether you're charged with a huge transformation initiative and it's going to go up and down, anybody who's done one knows it's going to go up and down. It's easy to feel sometimes that you're on the roller coaster and not driving the roller coaster. And by, again, applying this kind of an approach and intentional partnership, it really does give agency back to both the leader and the person that they're supervising who's undergoing the shock. And the same is true in the other scenario where you're giving them something outside of a comfort zone. Oftentimes people will see that as being done to them. This intentional approach really does return agency, which helps so much with motivation for both of these individuals to see their own development and progress more clearly as you go through something that can feel quite challenging. So I think that's incredibly important as you think about development of teams and highly effective teams.
Great, thanks, Melissa. Now we've kept a bit of time for Q&A. We will share the slides out so you'll have our contact details, but I'm actually going to stop sharing, and and just give you a moment to think about your question for us. There are a couple that have already come through, so we'll eagerly respond to those shortly. I'm just going to stop sharing, and please feel free to send your questions along. So Melissa would
A
just
question that said, why did we decide to call it a shock, which is a strong or brutal word instead of a disruption? Well, I'll share my thinking on why I liked the word shock, and then Tessa, you can share your thinking on on why you liked the word shock. I actually think the jarring nature of that word is important. Because when these things come along, they can be incredibly disruptive to an individual. They can feel very jarring. And in doing so, we have a tendency to get reactive and try and stop it as quickly as possible. And I think what we were trying to do is evoke that sense of shock and that sense of sort of jarring nature that can really disrupt what's going on in your day to day. And it's a way for you to think about that in a more positive light. You know, I had looking at productive tensions is something that also Tessa and I talk about a lot. And often we try and move to a binary. Something is either good or bad. It's not something that could be both. And in fact, a shock, what we're trying to do is use language that is often construed in a negative and think about that in a way that is much more productive and positive. So you can reclaim those things that feel as if they are kind of totally rocking you out of your regular day to day. And disruption, I think, in a way would be too sanitized for what the experience is actually like for a lot of leaders when they go through these periods of time.
Thanks, Melissa. Hard to add because you've got a lot of great points there. I would just reflect. We were interested. We had a lot of conversations around what the first word before the shock was going to be called, and so we landed
Yeah.
on smart. We started actually with safe shocking, and then we thought actually they're a little bit at odds with each other because it's not about being safe. We want to ensure that people feel safe, but actually we didn't want to deter people from being a little uncomfortable, and so it was interesting reflecting on even shock, what type of shock do we want to think about? And so we did deliberately pick smart shocking. We know smart is used as a concept in lots of different ways, but and also that idea of being measurable and thinking about impact and so on. And yeah, I would just also, and the psychologist in me really wants to reframe shock as, because when you say the word, you have that really negative visceral reaction, and so the more that we can kind of take that energy and think differently about and challenge that negativity that associated with it. We were really keen to do that, and we thought actually it gets people talking about it. And so I love that was the first question that was shared.
The other is, will we share the article? Yeah, we will
Yeah.
absolutely share the link to the article with the slides so that you'll be sure to get it if you didn't have a chance to take a look at the article in advance as well, for sure. And what are we looking for to identify when leaders are in the hot too long, and what's required to pull back the shock without losing momentum from the shock? Do you want to?
Yeah, really good question. So maybe I can kick things off, and then Melissa, please add. So when we're in that too hot zone, we'll start to see the leader. There's the idea of flight, fight, freeze, and so you'll start to see those the symptoms of overwhelm. Perhaps they're extra stressed. They're working really late hours. They're not keeping on top of things. They can start to see some of those elements that are quite indicative of feeling of overwhelm, I would say. And so for us, as the leader, particularly in the instance of a prolonged shock, which is probably where you'll see them staying in the hot for too long. The cadence in which the leader's leader is meeting with that leader will be really important. So you're not sort of leaving them off in their own devices too long, but you've got those regular touch points. So that leader's not getting to maybe experiencing that a toe into the overwhelm, but you're able to pull them back. And for us, it's the support. So one of the easiest ways of bringing them back into the kind of productive zone is what level of support, guidance, coaching, advice is that leader providing them, their leader's leader, as well as what other supports could you bring in from peers? What other development could you be integrating into that leader? So there's lots of different techniques depending on what's causing that overwhelm. And so that would be the biggest thing, is understand why that leader's feeling that overwhelm, and then pick the right strategy that's matched to that. Melissa,
Yeah.
what would you like to add on
I
that
think
one?
that
It's
was
a
an
great question.
excellent answer, Tessa. The only piece I would add is it goes back to, you can't be a lazy manager of people. You can't be a lazy leader of other leaders, no matter how senior those people are. And what I mean by that is you have to know your people to know when they're in too hot. And you have to have a number of interventions at your fingertips depending on those individuals. So I have some folks on my team that require and benefit from a lot more dialogue. when they're coming out of the hot zone, right? So a dialogue thought partnering approach is going to be really effective for them because it'll let me see how hot they've gotten and when they need to come back. Others, it's going to be unspoken behaviors, as Tessa was saying, right? They'll start to disengage. So me making sure that there's check-ins in place, that there's milestones in place so that I know if things are slipping, it's because they're starting to get to that space of overwhelm. If I apply one set of tactics and techniques to the other kind of a leader, it's not going to help them get out of the hot zone because, in fact, dialogue might overstress some of my leaders, whereas having milestone check-ins might overstress those that benefit from the dialogue. So it is really incumbent upon the leader of the leaders to really understand the kinds of folks that they're trying to help support.
Mm.
We have a, do you recommend pairing this methodology with any particular coaching method or style? I don't know that there is actually a particular coaching method or style from my perspective that pairs best with this. I do think authenticity is key in making this work because there has to be a genuine belief that while this has a format to it, it is not being done in a rote way. And so as you're coaching folks, your own authentic style could be adaptive. It could be that you're a guiding coach. It could be that you have a bit more of a directive coaching style, depending again on what your teams need. It can work with this technique, but it cannot feel as if you're just moving through steps by rote. It has to feel like there is sort of a genuine investment in the purpose of the shock and the appropriateness of that shock for the individual that you're working with.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, there'll be potentially moments within the shock that require different types of coaching. So they might not know where to go next, and you've got to take a bit more of a directive style rather than, and they'll get frustrated if you take them through more of the coaching style or question style of coaching. And so thinking about where you can adapt your coaching style along the duration of the shock is also a really important one.
Our next
Question
one is
here around our book.
watch for the book
Uh,
tour
The book
2027.
tour, yes. No, Melissa and I are devising a range of it. We often are thinking about a range of different topics. So watch this space. And finally, and keep them coming. We've still got time. So, another question around: is there a role in this approach for junior, less senior staff to support and enable their leaders as they go through smart shocks? Absolutely yes. Melissa, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think asking folks for some more intentionality in the way in which you navigate the work we have to get done is sort of a starting point, right? So if there's someone who's in a more junior role and they want to help support their leaders going through shocks, thinking about how those shocks can be beneficial for them personally, even, right? So what if they want to learn when a shock like this comes forward? Is it the communication shock they want to learn from? Is it the business process modeling? I think providing an opportunity for dialogue down as well as up becomes really helpful, right? So I know that for me, when I was going through the shock I described around the disruption and the organizational change, I had the ability to talk to some folks outside of my direct unit, but that were in different spaces who had gone through different organizational changes, and they were able to share their thoughts, but also ask me how I was navigating this space. So they were getting some learning out of it, and I was getting some more boots on the ground connection.
Mm,
So I think there is an opportunity always. Again, transparency, transparency, transparency. You can't learn from what you don't know is going on, and you can't understand the way in which someone might be approaching a situation if they haven't outlined what their goal is around that particular approach. So I think that for me becomes really important.
mm. And there's a particular shock at the moment, I think, which if we think of reverse mentoring as an idea, AI. And not to put not generalizations on generations, but it's likely that those in different generations will be better at AI. And actually, we're already starting to see that mentoring occur. So when I saw that question, I immediately thought of the shock of AI. And actually, what is the role of or junior or even those that are a little bit more experimental in AI to support their leaders to transverse through this shock of AI, which is going to be a multi-year shock that many of us are all going to be navigating. So that's where my brain went to. I'll just give you one more minute if there are any other questions. And thank you for the quality and thoughtfulness of each of those questions. They were excellent.
I will share as what people are thinking if there's any last questions. I was recently reading a Harvard Business Review article, and it had a great line in it about leadership, and it said you should seek to be essential, not involved.
Mm,
And I actually think this helps to frame out what essential would look like without being involved, right? You're not going to solve the problem for them. You're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of the business process mapping or development, but you are essential to them accomplishing their development and work. And so it's a
mm,
really good place for when you're in a leadership role where you have a really good team and you're not really sure like what your role is other than to make sure they've got money and move forward. This is a way for essential to show up in a really profound way that can help to accelerate your organization without being too involved and then being overwhelmed yourself. So that one kind of resonated for me. And thank you,
I might
Cassandra.
just, hang on, yeah, thanks, Cassandra. We had one more. How have we introduced this concept with senior executive staff and how has it been received? Melissa, you'll have to
So
explain that laugh. Yeah.
yeah, I have to laugh because most of them go, "Oh, that's so cool that you're doing that. Have fun." When we talk about it, but actually with my own teams, they were hilarious. They came to I was talking to them about this, and they said, "We're going to come to your webinar," and they came and they're like, "Oh, that's what you've been doing." So I maybe had failed a little bit on the transparency method, but they're like, "No, it totally worked that we used this model around some of the things that had been going on in our organization day to day." So with my own team, who are all AVPs or vice provosts, they have found this to be really useful as a structure for thought partnering with development in mind, especially for a lot of them who aren't like, I don't know what PD to take. Like I feel like I'm giving at most of the PD opportunities, not learning as much as I'd like
Mm,
to. So it's been really well received. And then I think from the very senior leaders, I will say I received a couple of comments from former folks who were in VP roles and above, and they were like, "Oh, do we need more shocks? I feel like all my days are shocks. Everything I do is a shock. Don't manufacture more." And so I think for them, you could see there's an overwhelm already. And perhaps there is an opportunity to spend a bit more time. But I've introduced this sort of subtly in other spots, and they're buying in a little bit more regularly to it.
yeah, thanks, Melissa. And with the kind of advising other executive leaders, we're really just asking them to experiment. And as Melissa mentioned, like it's not even necessarily about introducing new shocks. It's just putting good structure around the shocks or experiences that people are going through right now. So my focus has really been um, coaching on the pre and the post shock, which is to go, you're not running, these shocks aren't going anywhere, you can't run away from them, so why not, put better structure on either side and helping them think about that. So that's a really good place to start, particularly at those senior levels. And of course you get oh, is that my job to do? And I think what we're getting is as they're experimenting and they're seeing this learning and this aha moment of their team, it's really positively reinforcing the use of some of these concepts and ideas. That was my ask too for the group, which is we really, so we'll share our contact details. We really would love you to go out and experiment and tell us what you try, tell us what you learn. Even if you have questions around, oh, I'm wanting to trial a shock for myself or my team. What do you think, given, some of the demographics and characteristics? Like we're really keen to continue to think about this concept and grow it and consider it more deeply. So you'll have our contact details in the pack that comes around, and really open door, virtual door, to really get in touch and tell us more about what you're trying. Melissa, anything that you'd like to add in closing?
No, just thank you very much for joining us today and for the really great questions, as Tessa has said. And we're serious about this. We would love to hear
Mm.
from you, and we really do want to keep experimenting with this kind of work and seeing how it can continue to evolve. Because while the AI is coming and is here in some cases, the future is directed by people. And so making sure that those individuals can navigate increasingly complex spaces is what every leader's job is to try and help them do that. And so if you experiment with this and find some success or some failure that says we should adjust some thinking, we are very, very excited to hear about that and would love to have a conversation. So yeah, thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you all. Have a great evening, day, afternoon,
Whatever
and
time.
whatever time we look forward to seeing you again at perhaps the next one.